Hello and welcome back. In the previous video, we used the rotate root bone node in order to rotate the root bone back as we rotate our camera around in order to compensate to keep the character pointed forward. In this video, we're going to work on playing turn in place animations as soon as we've rotated past a maximum turning amount, which for us will be 90 degrees. Now, first we're going to take a look at Bellica's turn-in-place animations. So go to Paragon Lieutenant Bellica, Characters, Heroes, Bellica, Animations, and type in the search bar turn. Now you'll see that she has idle turn 180 left and right and idle turn 90 left and right. We want these 90-degree turns. So go ahead and highlight both of those. And here in our character folder, we have the animations. We're going to place these animations in our animations folder in _game. Now make sure to use copy here so that way we're not actually moving these animations, but we're making duplicates. Now go back to character/animations, and here we'll have our new turn in place animations. Now go ahead and open up idle turn 90 left. Now you'll see that she's turning in place, and then the rest of the animation she's standing still. So we really don't need most of this. So we can scrub through to basically the end of this turn in place, and then we can right click and remove the frame that we're on to the final frame. So we're on frame 20, we can remove frame 20 to frame 91, and now we've removed most of it. Go ahead and save this and close. Now open idle turn 90 right, and we're going to do the same thing. We can scrub through to where she's finished the animation, and that's about right here at frame 20. Maybe a little bit past for this one. We can go to about frame 22 and right click and remove the final frames 23 to 121. And that leaves us with just the turn animation. Go ahead and click save and close that. Now we're going to go into the characters shooter anim BP, and we're going to add some things to the idle pose. Before we do, let's take this stuff that we created last video here where we cached our rotated root bone pose. Let's give this a comment so we understand what we're doing. So hit C and say rotate root bone, and you can't see it because it's off screen. Here it says rotate root bone, and that is now commented. Now let's go all the way up to the top. Remember our ground locomotion state machine? Go inside that and we'll see here that we have our idle pose. Now double click idle and we'll see that we used to play idle relaxed, but then we started using play idle zero pose. Now we can delete play idle relaxed, we don't need that. We're going to create a couple of new state machines. So go ahead and disconnect this pin and delete play idle zero pose. We're going to create two state machines here. We're going to right click and type state machine, add new state machine, and we're going to call this idle lower body. Now we're going to right click and create another state machine, and we're going to call this state machine idle upper body. Now the idle upper body is simply going to be playing that idle zero pose. So double click idle upper body, and here down in the asset browser, search for idle zero pose. Here it is. We can just drag it in and we'll get a state by default that just contains the idle zero pose. Drag in the entry pin, and that's all we need for this state machine. Go back into the idle state, and now for idle lower body. Double click idle lower body. Here in idle lower body, we're also going to drag in idle zero pose, and we'll hook up the entry node to idle zero pose. But we're also going to have two more states in this state machine. We're going to use our idle turn 90 left and idle turn 90 right. Now we want to make sure we use our trimmed animations. So go back to our animations folder, and let's rename idle turn 90 left to have trimmed at the end, so trimmed. And we'll also rename idle turn 90 right so it has trimmed at the end. And we'll go back to our state machine and we'll drag these in. We'll search for trimmed. And here's our idle turn 90 left. We'll drag that in. And here's our idle turn 90 right. We'll drag that in. Now these are going to want transition rules from and to the idle 0 pose. So drag from idle 0 pose to idle turn 90 left trimmed, and drag from idle turn 90 left trimmed back up to idle 0 pose. We're going to do the same thing for idle turn 90 right trimmed as well. So make sure that we have transition rules to and from these animations. Now, because we dragged animations in, these states already have animations in them. We just need to fill out these transition rules. So we can start with the transition from idle 0 pose to the idle turn 90 left trimmed. That's the arrow going down from idle 0 pose down to idle turn 90 left trimmed. Double click on that transition rule. Now there's going to be a few things that need to be true in order to enter this transition. Well, first of all, we want our speed to be 0. We don't want to be moving. So let's type speed, get speed, and we're going to use an equal node. So type a double equals and we'll get an equal float. And this says equals 0. Now there's going to be multiple conditions here. So we're going to drag off this and type and bool. We're going to get an and boolean. And go ahead and hook that up to the result. Now we're going to have multiple things to hook up to this and. One is we want to see if our root yaw offset is greater than a certain amount. Now we wanted it to be 90 degrees, but we can make a parameter for this if we wanted to do that later. But for now, we'll just check to see if it's 90 degrees. So we're going to say root yaw offset. We're going to get that root yaw offset. We're going to check to see if it's greater than 90 degrees. So float is greater than float. And here we're going to put 90. And now plug this into the and. And now this says if both of these are true, we can enter the transition. But if just one of them is false, we will not enter, and we will not play that animation. Now, lastly, we want to check to see if we're in the air, because we don't want to transition to turn in place if we're in the air. So we're going to say is in air, and we're going to get is in air and make sure that it's not true. So we need a not Boolean node. And of course, this and only has 2 input pins, but we can click the plus here to get another pin, and we can plug is in air in. Now all of these have to be true to enter the transition. So that takes care of our idle lower body to idle turn 90 left trimmed. We can now do our transition rule from idle 0 pose to idle turn 90 right. And that's this arrow pointing downward. Go ahead and double click on that. Now this is going to be very similar. We're going to check to see if the speed is 0. So first get speed. Check to see if it's equal to 0 using an equal float node. And then we're going to use an and Boolean. Now use this and plug it into the result. Next, we're going to want to check our root yaw offset. So right click and get root yaw offset. And we're going to check to see if this is now less than negative 90. So remember, to turn left, we wanted to see if root yaw offset was greater than 90. But now we want to see if it's less than negative 90. That means we've rotated clockwise so much that we've gone past 90 degrees and root yaw offset negative 90 degrees. Go ahead and plug this into the and we're going to check one more variable, and that's is in air. So is in air. I'm going to check to make sure that that's not true. So we'll get a not Boolean, add a pin to the and plug this into it. So now all 3 of these must be true in order to enter the result. So that takes care of going from idle 0 pose into the turning animations. But now we need to handle the transition rules to go from these turning animations back to idle 0 pose. So let's go from idle turn left 90 trimmed back to idle 0 pose. Let's go to that transition rule. Now first we're going to see if we've played most of our animation. So we can use a time remaining ratio node. So time remaining ratio. And this node will give us the amount of time remaining as a ratio of the whole animation. So if we drag off of this and use a less than float node, we can check to see if the time remaining is less than a certain ratio of the animation. For example, 10%. So we can use 0.1. And this means that if only 10% of the animation or less is left, this will return true. Now we're going to have multiple conditions for this as well, but this time we're going to use an OR Boolean because we want to exit the idle turn 90 left trimmed animation if any of these conditions are true. The next is to see if speed is greater than 0. So get speed and check to see if it's greater than using a greater than float, and we'll use greater than 0. If that is true, then we want to get out of this animation as well. Also, we want to see if is in air is true. So right click, type is in air, get is in air. And if that's true, we also want to exit this animation. So add a pin and use get is in air for that. And finally, we want to see if root yaw offset is negative. So we'll get root yaw offset and we'll use a float is less than float node and see if it's less than 0. And then we'll add a pin and add this. So if we're turning left, then this means our root yaw offset is positive. But if it becomes negative, we suddenly want to stop playing the animation because we don't need to be turning left anymore. Root yaw offset should never be negative when we're turning left. So that will also trigger us to get out of the animation. Now let's go back and we'll handle the idle turn 90 right trimmed back to idle 0 pose. So let's get that. And this will be also similar to exiting out of the turn left animation. We're going to use a time remaining ratio. So time remaining ratio. And again, we'll see if it's less than 0.1. So use a float is less than float. See if it's less than 0.1. And we're also going to use an OR for this one because we'll have multiple conditions. So OR Boolean, hook this up to result. And we also want to exit out of this animation if the speed is greater than 0. So right click, get speed. If it's greater than, so use a greater than float node if it's greater than 0. Now we also want to check to see if we're in the air, so is in air. If we are in the air, we'll also exit. So add a pin and hookup is in air. And then finally, we'll check our root yaw offset. So root yaw offset, we'll get that. And this time we're going to check to see if it's greater than 0. And we'll add a pin and hook that up. Now, again, this is the opposite of the turning left animation. When we're turning right, then that means root yaw offset is negative. It should not be positive. If it becomes positive, we should not be turning left. So we're going to use that as a condition as well. So that takes care of this state machine. Now we're going to go back to our idle, and we have this idle lower body and idle upper body. Now idle lower body is playing the turn in place animations. Idle upper body is simply playing the idle 0 pose. So we're going to blend these using a layered blend per bone. So layered blend per bone, get a layered blend per bone node. And the base pose is going to be the idle lower body, and the idle upper body will be the blend pose. Now, layered blend per bone, if we expand our details panel, we need to add a bone for this layered blend per bone node. So here in config, click the drop down next to layer setup, click the drop down next to this first element, and then in branch filters, we'll add with the plus, click the drop down next to that element, and now we have the option to use a bone name. Now remember, spine 01 is the bone right in the middle of the spine. So let's go ahead and first type in spine, all lowercase, underscore 01. And that gives us the spine that's right about at the waist. So what this is going to do is it's going to have two different poses. One for the lower body, that's the base pose, and for the upper body and above, starting at spine 01, we'll play idle upper body, which is simply the base pose. Go ahead and compile this and save. Now we can try this out. So let's go ahead and press play. And we'll engage, and as we're turning, we'll see what happens when we reach 90 degrees to the right. There we played the animation. And now we'll see if we reach 90 degrees to the left, we played the other animation. And that is all we need to be doing right now. We actually haven't programmed the ability for the root bone to rotate back towards our direction of movement. All we're doing is playing the animation. And also, just by the way, we should go into idle lower body, into these idle turn 90 left trimmed and turn 90 right trimmed states, and select these animations and make sure we don't loop them. So go ahead and uncheck loop animation in both of these. So select, uncheck loop animation, compile, and save. So this is going to conclude the video. We are one step closer to our turn in place animation mechanic. In the next video, we will continue with this by programming the ability to rotate the root bone towards our controller rotation direction, this aim rotation that we are using to rotate the camera. So stay tuned. We'll see you in the next video.